the harsh winter of 1941, the city of Leningrad stood as German forces encircled it, marking the beginning of one of the longest and deadliest sieges in history. For 872 days, Leningrad faced relentless German assaults, starvation, and bitter cold. But beyond the city walls, fierce battles raged as German forces fought to hold their grip and close in on the Soviet stronghold. This is the full story of the Siege of Leningrad, a relentless struggle marked by courage, tragedy, and a will to survive that defied all odds. The most significant city of Soviet communism was Leningrad, originally named Petrograd or St. Petersburg after its founder Tsar Peter the Great. The port city on the Neva River, 400 miles northwest of Moscow, was established in 1703. For 2 centuries, from 1712 to 1918, it served as the capital of the Russian Empire. It was a city of grandeur, a centre of wealth and power, where tsars and tsarinas ruled from magnificent Baroque palaces, their influence reaching far beyond Russia's borders. The city was famous for its gold-domed cathedrals, cultural heritage, and political intrigue, a place where diplomacy and empire-building mixed with the darker side of Russian autocracy. This all began to change with the seismic shift of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. The revolution, which toppled the Romanov dynasty and overthrew the imperial government, ushered in a new radical system of governance run by individuals whose ambitions were as ruthless as they were power-hungry. The blood-red banner of communism was soon hoisted above the city, marking the rise of the Bolshevik Party and the beginning of a brutal regime that would transform Russia. What had once been the seat of Tsarist power was now to be the birthplace of a communist empire. The revolutionaries, led by the fanatical Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who famously adopted the name Vladimir Lenin, initiated a reign of terror as they seized control of Petrograd. As Lenin's forces killed their way into power, the city became the focal point of the new Soviet order, with figures like Grigory Zinoviev, Leon Trotsky, and Joseph Stalin at Lenin's side, each vying for control in this deadly game of political chess. To immortalize the Marxist leader and symbolically cement the new regime's control, Petrograd was renamed Leningrad just 5 days after Lenin's death on January 26, 1924. The renaming was more than a tribute, it was an ideological statement, turning the city that had once symbolized Russian monarchy into a symbol of Soviet power and communist revolution. Leningrad would be forever intertwined with Lenin's legacy, becoming a beacon of Soviet industrial strength and communist ideology. But for Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Germany, Leningrad was a symbol of everything he despised. His deep-seated fear and hatred of communism made Leningrad one of his primary targets when Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. In his eyes, the annihilation of Leningrad was not just a military goal, but a necessary step in exterminating communism itself. Hitler was convinced that Leningrad could be wiped off the map, obliterated, erased from existence. His confidence was bolstered by the recent Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, in which the Soviet Red Army suffered humiliating losses to Finland, a much smaller nation. Despite overwhelming numbers, the Red Army lost badly, suffering nearly 1 million casualties during the so-called Winter War. For Hitler, this debacle, combined with Stalin's brutal purges of his officer corps throughout the 1930s, was evidence that the Soviet military was weak, disorganized, and incapable of defending its territory. If the Soviets could barely defeat the Finns, how could they possibly withstand his invasion force of 3 million highly trained and well-equipped German soldiers? Beyond its symbolic value, Leningrad was also a crucial industrial hub by 1939. The city accounted for 11% of the USSR's total industrial output, making it a key player in Soviet war production. Factories in Leningrad churned out vital military equipment, weapons, and supplies needed to support the Red Army's defense of the Soviet Union. Its strategic importance was undeniable, which is why, when the Nazis launched their surprise attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Leningrad became one of the primary objectives for German Army Group North. The capture of Leningrad was not just a point of pride for Hitler, it was essential for the success of Nazi operations in the northern theatre of World War II. Controlling Leningrad would cripple the Soviet war effort and open a path to dominating the Baltic region. Hitler envisioned the city's destruction as the ultimate triumph, a way to shatter Soviet morale and set the stage for a complete Nazi victory. For nearly 900 days, from August 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad endured one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history as the German forces surrounded the city, cutting it off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The siege would become a symbol of Soviet resilience, but for Hitler, it was supposed to be the key to breaking the Soviet Union once and for all. Germany's Army Group North was poised and ready to strike. The German attack, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, named after the red-bearded Frederick I, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and King of Germany, would begin on June 22, 1941. The strategic objectives of the three-pronged invasion included the destruction of the Soviet Red Army, the capture of key cities, and the rapid occupation of Soviet territory. Army Group North's designated goal was the city of Leningrad, a symbol of Soviet power and a vital industrial and military hub. At the helm of this formidable offensive was one of Hitler's most trusted and renowned warlords, the 65-year-old Field Marshal Wilhelm Josef Franz Ritter von Leeb. Slender, bald, and with an austere demeanour, von Leeb was personally selected by Hitler to lead the charge on Leningrad, a task that would require both military genius and a ruthless determination to bring down the symbolic Soviet stronghold. Hitler had long respected von Leeb for his skill and discipline, attributes that had earned him a stellar reputation in the German military. Von Leeb's military career stretched back to 1895 when he first enlisted in the Imperial German Army. Over the decades, he demonstrated remarkable skill, advancing quickly through the ranks. During World War I, von Leeb distinguished himself on the battlefield, earning the prestigious Austrian Order of Max Joseph, which came with the ennobling title of von, making him Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. This recognition elevated his status among the military elite, and his continued success during the interwar years cemented his position as one of Germany's most capable commanders. His reputation as a brilliant strategist was solidified in 1940, when during Hitler's invasion of France, his forces successfully breached the famed Maginot Line, the heavily fortified French defensive barrier thought to be impregnable. This victory not only demonstrated von Leeb's tactical prowess, but also paved the way for the swift German conquest of France. In recognition of his achievements, Hitler personally awarded him the coveted Ritterkreuz, Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, a high military honour, and an army field marshal's baton adorned with jewels, symbolising his elevated status in the Nazi military hierarchy. By June 1941, Field Marshal von Leeb stood at the head of Army Group North, commanding a formidable force. His group included one panzer group, the 4th Panzer Group, composed of 8 divisions, and 2 powerful armies, the 16th Army with 8 divisions, and the 18th Army with 7 divisions. In addition to these forces, von Leeb had several divisions held in reserve, ready to be deployed as needed. The German war machine was well oiled and prepared for a swift and decisive invasion. The plan was simple: to crush Soviet resistance in the Baltic states and capture Leningrad from the south. Von Leeb's forces would march from East Prussia through Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. The goal was not just the capture of the city, but to deliver a psychological blow to the Soviet leadership and its people. Leningrad, once the imperial capital of Russia, was now a city of immense industrial importance, producing a significant share of the USSR's war supplies. Its capture would weaken Soviet defences and disrupt its war production. Hitler's intention was not only to seize Leningrad, but to erase it from the map entirely. On the other side, the Soviet authorities believed that Leningrad was as ready as it could be for the coming onslaught. The city had been preparing for war, fortifying its defences and mobilising its military assets. The Leningrad Fortified Region, a massive defensive command structure, was established to coordinate the city's defences. This included not only the municipal garrison, but also the powerful Baltic Fleet which was stationed nearby. Additional defensive units were organised into the Koporie, Southern and Slutsk-Kolpino groups, responsible for holding key positions around the city. The Megar position, a line of fortifications, was also prepared to stop the German advance. Despite these preparations, the Soviet leadership in Leningrad knew that the city faced an overwhelming force. The Germans were determined to take Leningrad, and the Soviet forces, while resolute, were outnumbered and outgunned. Yet, for all its grim prospects, the defence of Leningrad would become a testament to Soviet resilience, as the city prepared itself for one of the longest and most brutal sieges in military history. Furthermore, the Volkhov Front, the Soviet term equivalent to a US Army group, was commanded by Lieutenant General Kirill Meretskov, a seasoned officer with a tumultuous history. Meretskov had only recently been released from an NKVD, Soviet secret police prison, where he had been imprisoned during one of Stalin's infamous purges. His return to command was both a testament to his military skill and a reflection of the desperate situation the Soviet Union found itself in as German forces advanced. The Volkhov Front was a crucial element in the defense of Leningrad, and Meretskov's leadership would soon play a pivotal role in the coming battle. The Red Army had arranged its forces strategically around Leningrad in preparation for the German assault. The 23rd Red Army was positioned in the northern sector between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, aiming to prevent a German breakthrough from that direction. To the west, the 48th Red Army took up positions to defend the city from encirclement, while the 67th Army held the eastern sector to protect the city's industrial heart. In the south, the 55th Army braced for the main German push, as Army Group North advanced with overwhelming force. These defensive positions were crucial in the Soviet effort to delay the German onslaught and buy time for reinforcements. Just days after Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union commenced on June 22, 1941. The civilian population of Leningrad sprang into action. On June 27th, first response civilian organizations were formed in Leningrad, and an astonishing mobilization of over 1 million people began constructing fortifications on the northern and southern outskirts of the city. There was a widespread belief that the German advance could be stopped, and the city's citizens worked tirelessly to build defences, displaying a determination that would define the Siege of Leningrad. Decades after the war, Colonel General Georgy K. Zhukov, one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated military leaders, reflected on the significance of Leningrad's defence. Leningrad is a significant industrial centre and seaport. Leningrad's pre-war population was 3,103,000, with the suburbs adding up to 3,385,000. If Leningrad had fallen, our powerful Baltic fleet would have been lost, and the Red Army would have had to create a new northern front to defend Moscow. The loss of Leningrad would have dealt a devastating blow to Soviet war production and territorial integrity, forcing the Red Army to reposition and regroup at great cost. Zhukov's recollection highlights the high stakes of the battle and the dire consequences of failure. To bolster the city's defence, 10 volunteer divisions were hastily formed between June and August 1941. These divisions, composed of civilians, factory workers, students and older men not yet drafted into the Red Army, took up arms alongside the regular army. In addition to these infantry units, 16 distinct artillery and volunteer machine gun battalions were also raised, providing much needed firepower. The city's population, from young to old, was conscripted into the defence effort, transforming Leningrad into a fortress as the German forces closed in. The southern Luga River line was established in June 1941 as one of the primary defensive positions, stretching from the Chudovo-Gachina-Uritsk-Pulkovo posts all the way to the Neva River. This waterway became a natural barrier against German advance from the south. Further defensive lines connected the positions of Peterhof, Gachina and Koltusk, creating a web of fortified zones designed to slow down and entrap the advancing Germans. The northern defence line, which had been established years earlier to protect the Karelian fortified region from Finnish incursions, was also activated, adding another layer of defence to the already heavily fortified city. The scale of the defensive preparations in Leningrad was staggering. According to official statistics, civilians and soldiers alike constructed or excavated over 25,000 miles of entrenchments, 395 miles of barbed wire, and 430 miles of anti-tank ditches. Over 5,000 mud and timber emplacements were built to shield the defenders from enemy fire, while reinforced concrete bunkers dotted the landscape. In addition, 190 miles of wooden barricades were erected to impede enemy vehicles and infantry. The sheer volume of fortifications reflected the determination of the defenders, but it raised a haunting question. Could these defences withstand the seemingly unstoppable German war machine? Adding to the complexity of Leningrad's defence, Finland, which shared a long and contentious border with the Soviet Union, had become an ally of Nazi Germany. After the humiliating defeat the Soviet Union suffered in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, during which Finland managed to repel the much larger Soviet Red Army, Finland found itself in a precarious position. Hitler saw an opportunity to exploit Finland's grievances against the Soviet Union and made a deal. In exchange for Finnish cooperation in Operation Barbarossa, Hitler promised to arm and equip the Finnish military with modern German weapons, securing Finland's northern flank and preventing future Soviet aggression. For Finland, this was a devil's bargain. Still reeling from the Winter War, Finland sought to regain the territories it had lost to the Soviet Union and protect itself from further Soviet incursions. Hitler's offer of military support was tempting, but it came with the heavy price of aligning with Nazi Germany. With the promise of revenge and military aid, Finland joined the German army's efforts to encircle and destroy Leningrad. Finnish forces played a crucial role in cutting off Leningrad from the north, sealing the city's fate as it became encircled by German and Finnish troops. The Führer held deep admiration for Field Marshal Karl Baron Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the legendary commander-in-chief of the Finnish army, a man whose resilience had made Finland one of the few nations able to stand against the Soviet Union. Hitler believed Mannerheim would be a critical ally in the Siege of Leningrad, and fully expected him to be present in the city once it fell. The Finnish army, under Mannerheim's patriotic leadership, joined the Nazi offensive on June 22, 1941, as Operation Barbarossa began its devastating march across Soviet territory. From June to September 1941, the Finnish army fielded 475,000 combat-ready troops, surpassing the number of soldiers they had during the Winter War just a year prior. In the northern theatre, Finland's army even outnumbered the Germans, boasting 530,000 troops to Germany's 220,000. Despite being less armoured and mechanised than their German counterparts, Finland's military relied heavily on a formidable artillery division. However, they possessed only one tank battalion and had limited motorised infantry, placing them at a tactical disadvantage when compared to the fast-moving and mechanised German Wehrmacht. The coordination between the German and Finnish armies was critical to the broader Nazi strategy in the north. Field Marshal von Lieb, leading Germany's Army Group North, had planned to link up with the Finnish army at the Svir River east of Leningrad, hoping to encircle the city from all sides. This move was key to completing the Siege of Leningrad, isolating the city and preventing Soviet forces from mounting any form of counterattack. Yet, despite German ambitions, this connection with the Finnish army was never realised. The German High Command had expected their Finnish allies to march around Lake Ladoga and join forces with the Nazis. Hitler believed that Mannerheim would fully cooperate in this endeavour, sealing Leningrad's fate. However, Mannerheim had a personal history and a hidden allegiance that would thwart these plans. Despite his firm opposition to the Soviet regime and its leaders, Mannerheim had a deep-rooted connection to the Russian people and their culture. Having served in the Russian Imperial Army during the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, Mannerheim held a unique perspective on Russia, one that differentiated its people from its political system. While he opposed Bolshevism, he had no desire to destroy Russia or its people. Hitler's Campaign Directive No. 21 outlined Finland's anticipated role in Operation Barbarossa. The mass of the Finnish army will have the task, in accordance with the advance made by the northern wing of the German armies, of tying up maximum Russian strength by attacking to the west, or on both sides of Lake Ladoga, the directive read. Hitler expected Finland to engage Soviet forces aggressively and aid in the destruction of Leningrad by tightening the noose around the city, yet Mannerheim had no intention of being a part of the Nazi plot to annihilate the city or starve its inhabitants into submission. Both Mannerheim and Finnish President Risto Ryti agreed early on that Finland would not participate in a direct assault on Leningrad. Despite pressure from the Germans, Finland refused to take part in the destruction of what many in Finland still regarded as a city with deep historical and cultural significance. Mannerheim went even further by rejecting Hitler's offer to lead an 80,000-man German corps. From the outset of the Nazi-Finnish alliance, Mannerheim maintained a level of independence, resisting the German insistence on full military cooperation. He also refused to assist in completely encircling Leningrad, leaving a gap in the German siege lines and frustrating Hitler's ambitions. This reluctance from Mannerheim effectively stalled the German advance and contributed to the eventual failure of Army Group North's plan to capture Leningrad. Despite their combined strength, the inability to fully encircle the city, thanks in part to Mannerheim's resistance, would leave the Germans unable to achieve a decisive victory. Lieb, tasked with leading the northern front, found himself unable to overcome this obstacle, and his forces became bogged down as the Soviet defenders and Leningrad's population prepared for the brutal siege to come. Meanwhile, on the first day of Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941, Lieb had assigned the 4th Panzer Corps to lead the initial assault. The corps was commanded by Colonel General Erich Höppner, a 55-year-old veteran of the Great War. Hoepner's reputation as a hardened and aggressive commander made him an ideal choice for the spearhead of the attack. His vision of the war, however, was marked by a ruthless war. In a chilling message to his troops at the start of the operation, Hoepner declared, "The war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's fight for existence. It is the ancient German-Slavic conflict, the denial of Bolshevism, and the protection of German culture from the Muscovite Asiatic torrent." Hoepner's message encapsulated the ideological hatred that fueled the German invasion of the Soviet Union. For him, and many in the German high command, the war in the East was not merely a military conflict but a racial and cultural struggle. His orders to his troops were clear. The destruction of modern-day Russia must be the aim of this war, and as such it must be fought with unprecedented ruthlessness. No mercy is to be shown. While the Germans made significant initial gains, the refusal of Finland to fully align with the German war effort in Leningrad would be a key factor in the eventual stalemate and failure of Army Group North's campaign. Mannerheim's defiance not only frustrated Hitler's plans but also contributed to the preservation of Leningrad, which, despite suffering one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history, would not fall. The 41st, led by General Georg Hans Reinhardt, who had broken through Warsaw's defences in 1939, and the 56th, commanded by renowned cavalryman General Erich von Manstein, whose panzers had exploded out of the Ardennes to overrun Belgium and northern France in 1940, made up Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group. Reinhardt and Manstein were among the most competent leaders of other armoured forces. The Russians were sent reeling when Hoepner's detachment struck the 8th Red Army manning the frontier at morning. The operation went remarkably well at first. Any Soviet units in Lieb's path were pushed back, overrun, and reduced to a bloody mess. Whatever the Soviets were stupid enough to put in their way, Army Group North kept moving forward. Over the state-run radio in Moscow, Foreign Affairs Minister Vyacheslav Molotov declared, "German troops assaulted our country at 4 a.m. today without a declaration of war and dropped aerial bombs on Kaunas, Kiev, Sevastopol, Zhytomyr and other cities. The government urges all Soviet citizens to unite even more behind our great leader and comrade Stalin, our Soviet government, and our wonderful Bolshevist party. We have a good reason. We'll vanquish the enemy. We're going to win." The 4th Panzer Group defeated Soviet armour in the Battle of Raseiniai, June 23rd to 27th, in Lithuania, causing an estimated 90,000 Red Army casualties on its brutal journey to Leningrad. Hoepner had reportedly destroyed 1,000 Soviet tanks before arriving at the breached defensive Stalin line. The Dvina River, which ran into the Gulf of Riga, was a significant natural barrier that the 4th Panzer Group encountered as it pushed north. In order to overcome this challenge, German engineers swiftly built bridges across the lake. In an attempt to halt Manstein's advance, the Soviet 3rd Mechanized Corps was called up, but it was in vain. The 3rd lost 70 tanks, and the survivors were forced to evacuate the area. Every German soldier's spirits were raised by the thrill of being a part of such a historic event as the 2 Panzer Corps proceeded to thunder toward Leningrad at breakneck speed. General Christian Hansen's X-Corps captured Kaunas on June 24th and repulsed 23rd Rifle Division counterattacks. Meanwhile, the German 16th Army, commanded by General Ernst Busch, was advancing steadily toward the Mamet River, where it aimed to drive a wedge between the Soviet 8th and 11th Armies. This maneuver was critical in disrupting the Soviet defences, which were already faltering under the weight of the relentless German onslaught. Simultaneously, the 18th Army, under the leadership of General Georg von Küchler, moved along the Baltic coast, pushing deeper into Soviet territory. As the German ground forces advanced, they were supported by Luftwaffe aircraft which bombed enemy formations from the sky, further disorganizing and demoralizing the Red Army. Across the front, the Red Army was receiving bad news. On June 25, 1941, the 21st Mechanized Corps attempted to halt the advance of the 56th Panzer Corps west of the Dvina River, but failed miserably. The Soviet forces, lacking coordination and effective communication, were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by the highly mobile and well-trained German units. At Raseiniai, the 12th Mechanized Corps mounted a desperate counterattack using KV-1 and T-34 tanks against the German 41st Panzer Corps. Although these tanks were some of the most advanced in the Soviet arsenal, they were not enough to stop the German advance. The 12th Mechanized Corps was annihilated in the process, another devastating blow to Soviet efforts to stem the tide of the Nazi invasion. Desperate to block the German advance and hold the bridgehead established by the 41st and 56th Panzer Corps, Semyon Timoshenko, chairman of Stavka, the Soviet Armed Forces Supreme Command, ordered all available forces to the Dvina River. The Soviet command knew that losing control of the Dvina would mean an uncontested German drive deeper into Soviet territory. However, the 16th Army, mopping up behind the 4th Panzer Group, continued its advance, while Kuchler's 18th Army faced strong Soviet counterattacks to the north. The Red Army's efforts, though courageous, were poorly coordinated and ultimately futile against the seasoned German divisions. The Soviet Air Force launched a series of assaults against the German bridgehead over the Dvina River, hoping to slow down or halt the German advance. Despite these efforts, the attacks failed, and the German juggernaut continued its relentless march forward. Lieb's Army Group North, reinforced by Luftwaffe air superiority, kept pouring troops and supplies through the breached Soviet defences, seemingly unstoppable in its drive toward Leningrad. On July 1, 1941, General Albert Rodrig's German 26th Corps captured the Latvian capital, Riga, delivering another blow to the Soviets in the northern theatre. With Riga in German hands, the Baltic region was rapidly falling under Nazi control. Finnish army units further north also made significant gains against the Soviets, tightening the noose on Leningrad from both the north and south. By July 4th, German General Reinhardt's soldiers had captured Ostrov, and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps was rapidly approaching the Latvian-Russian border. In a decisive engagement, German heavy artillery destroyed 140 Soviet tanks that had been sent to halt Reinhardt's advance. The Soviet losses were staggering, and their ability to mount any effective defense was dwindling. When news of these victories reached Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, was elated. "There is no longer any doubt that we will win in Russia," he proclaimed. Goebbels saw the rapid collapse of Soviet defences as confirmation of Nazi ideology, stating, "Nothing will be allowed to survive under Bolshevism." For Goebbels and the Nazi leadership, the war in the East was not just a military campaign but a racial and ideological crusade, one that they believed would end with the total destruction of the Soviet Union. As the days passed, one Red Army counterattack after another was repulsed with catastrophic losses, and one city, town and hamlet after another fell to the advancing Germans. By July 6th, German forces had taken control of both Latvia and Lithuania and were pushing toward Estonia. The speed of the German advance left Soviet forces reeling, and the German military juggernaut seemed invincible. However, a critical shift in focus was ordered by the German High Command on July 8th. Lieb received new orders. LVI Panzer Corps was to strike toward Lake Ilmen, over 140 miles southeast of Leningrad, while Army Group North was instructed to relocate the 41st Panzer Corps to the Luga River, the last major defensive line before Leningrad itself. Capturing the Luga River was essential for launching a full-scale assault on Leningrad, as it would allow the Germans to cut off Soviet supply routes and prepare for a prolonged siege. Despite the ferocity of the German assault, Reinhardt's 41st Corps failed to capture its intended target at the Luga. The Soviets had mounted a tenacious defense, using every available resource to hold the line. Meanwhile, Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps succeeded in taking the village of Porkov on July 10th. While this was a victory for the Germans, it raised concerns within the German command. For the first time since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the German advance had been slowed, and the previously unyielding assault had been blunted. This marked a turning point in the campaign as the Soviets began to dig in and prepare for a bitter, prolonged defense of their sacred city, Leningrad. When Colonel General Erich Hübner's 4th Panzer Group was nearly brought to a standstill by the Soviet 8th Army, Hübner faced a serious challenge in maintaining the momentum of his forces. To break through the Soviet resistance, he hastily organised a Kampfgruppe battle group from the 6th Panzer Division, part of the 41st Corps, and sent it north with the hope of overcoming the opposition and bypassing the enemy's defensive lines. However, what the Kampfgruppe encountered was not merely Soviet forces, but the relentless and unforgiving terrain of northern Russia. The landscape was dotted with streams and rivers, flanked by soft sand and swamps that swallowed vehicles whole. The German column also encountered dense clouds of mosquitoes, bad roads, and crumbling wooden bridges that had to be rebuilt under fire before the vehicles could proceed. Tanks and half-tracks often bogged down in the heavy sand or thick mud, causing the entire column to halt as recovery trucks were summoned to retrieve the immobilized vehicles. Day after day, the Kampfgruppe made only limited progress, covering just a few miles after several days of grueling effort. At this pace, it seemed unlikely that they would reach Leningrad before the brutal Russian winter set in, and the troops knew that the coming cold would complicate their mission even further. The march was slow, exhausting, and increasingly demoralizing for the German soldiers. As the column pushed forward, they began to notice dark plumes of smoke rising on the horizon. The Soviets, following a scorched earth policy, were burning villages, farms and crops, determined to leave nothing of value for the advancing Germans. The smouldering ruins were a constant reminder that the invaders would find no respite, no supplies, and no shelter in the harsh northern landscape. Every inch of Soviet territory would have to be taken at great cost. Worse yet, the dust clouds kicked up by the tracks of tanks, the wheels of vehicles, and the boots of soldiers made the Kampfgruppe an easy target for Soviet airmen. Alerted to their presence, Soviet planes swooped down on the German column with bombs and strafing machine gun fire, further slowing their progress and inflicting casualties. The Germans, far from the air cover they had relied on in earlier stages of the campaign, were exposed and vulnerable. Meanwhile, in Leningrad, the city braced for the impending siege. By mid-July, food rationing had been implemented as supplies began to dwindle and prices for basic necessities soared. The cultural heart of Leningrad, the Hermitage Museum, took urgent steps to protect its priceless collection of paintings, sculptures, and artifacts. Some of the most valuable pieces were concealed in underground vaults, while others were crated and transported out of the city to preserve them from the destruction the Germans would soon unleash. Plans were made to evacuate 400,000 women and children from the city, though the evacuation process was slow and incomplete. While no bombs had fallen yet, German reconnaissance planes were increasingly visible over Leningrad, signaling the coming storm. Monuments, public buildings, and cultural landmarks were surrounded by protective scaffolding and sandbags in an effort to shield them from the devastation to come. On July 19, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued Directive No. 33 outlining specific tasks for his invading forces and laying out the next phase of the campaign. Only after the 18th Army has established contact with the 4th Panzer Group and the 16th Army has sufficiently secured the vast eastern flank will the advance on Leningrad be resumed, Hitler stated, making it clear that the northern push would continue only after these critical objectives were met. He further directed Army Group North to prevent Soviet forces in Estonia from retreating toward Leningrad, effectively cutting off any Soviet reinforcements that might have strengthened the city's defences. Additionally, the Germans were ordered to press north toward Lake Ladoga, where they could further tighten the noose around the besieged city. By the end of July, Hitler, growing impatient with the slower-than-expected progress, rushed to his field headquarters, furious. He demanded that Leningrad fall by December 1941, before the onset of the harsh Russian winter, which the Germans feared could cripple their operations. Determined to force the issue, Hitler ordered Laib to bring in more troops, tanks, artillery, and planes for the next phase of the assault. The Führer was adamant, the city must fall now, before winter set in. In the meantime, the Finnish Southeastern Army continued its steady advance toward Leningrad, delivering a crushing blow to the Soviet 23rd Army on July 31st. The Finns, who enjoyed air superiority in their sector, inflicted heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. That same day, Hansen's X-Corps reached the southern shore of the massive Lake Ladoga, further tightening the encirclement of Leningrad. Yet the cost of the German offensive was steep. By the end of July, German casualties since the start of Operation Barbarossa had reached 213,000, a sobering figure that underscored the high price of the Nazi campaign. Despite these losses, the Germans held firm on the southern approaches to Leningrad, while the Finns secured the northern flanks. The Finnish army successfully cut the last Soviet railway link north of the city, severing critical supply lines. At several key points in Lapland, the Finnish forces further tightened their hold on the region, isolating Leningrad from the rest of the Soviet Union. Elite Alpenkorps units of the German army, previously stationed in German-occupied Norway, were redeployed to Finland. However, the strict orders issued by Field Marshal Mannerheim, the Finnish commander-in-chief, prohibited these German forces from participating directly in combat. Instead, they were relegated to logistical and support roles. By August 31st, the Finns had pushed deep into eastern Karelia and were within striking distance of Leningrad's northern suburbs. The Finnish advance had brought them to within 20 kilometers of the city's outskirts, near the pre-war Finnish-Russian boundary posts, established after the Winter War in 1939. The noose around Leningrad was tightening. Both the Germans and Finns had achieved significant gains, yet the fall of the city remained elusive as Soviet forces braced for the long siege to come. The Finns, determined to reclaim the territories they had lost during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, deployed along the length of the former frontier, securing key positions on the coasts of Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. By capturing Red Army salients at Belustrov and Kirjasalo on the Karelian Isthmus, they consolidated their hold on these strategic locations. Finnish forces were now positioned to support the encirclement of Leningrad, though their commitment to the full capture of the city was far from certain. On August 6, 1941, Adolf Hitler publicly declared his three primary campaign objectives for the Soviet Union: Leningrad first, the Donets Basin second, and Moscow third. In his eyes, Leningrad represented a key to the Soviet heartland, and its capture would cripple Soviet morale. Hitler, supremely confident in the prowess of his forces, expected to capture Leningrad within 6 weeks, and Moscow soon after. He predicted that Stalin would be forced to sue for peace within 8 weeks, and that by Christmas 1941, the war on the Eastern Front would be over, with Germany triumphant. However, not everyone in the German High Command agreed with Hitler's priorities. Colonel General Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of the German Army from 1938 to 1942, later recalled that Hitler had abruptly changed his mind about capturing Moscow, diverting resources to Leningrad instead. After Army Group Center had achieved its first goal, Halder noted, Hitler wanted it reduced to a weak holding force and the bulk of its troops diverted to the north so as to hasten the capture of Leningrad. To Halder and many other German military strategists, this shift was driven more by Hitler's political ambitions than sound military reasoning. The idea of wheeling more than 1 million men and countless vehicles through nearly trackless terrain as if they were a parade battalion was ludicrous. It was Hitler's personal obsession with destroying Leningrad rather than practical military strategy that led to this decision. As Army Group North neared Leningrad, its forces stood on the verge of capturing the city. Without any support from the centre, they had advanced close enough to proceed with the city's capture. Yet, in a sudden shift, Hitler intervened and prevented the final offensive, expressing a sudden inclination to be content with merely encircling the city rather than storming it outright. On August 21st, Hitler issued Directive No. 34, instructing Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb to maintain his assault between Lake Ilmen and Narva, with the goal of linking up with Finnish forces to complete the encirclement of Leningrad. Hitler, recognizing the importance of cutting off all avenues of escape for the city's population, directed the Luftwaffe to target evacuation routes by bombing railway lines and other escape routes. The civilians of Leningrad were to be trapped with no means of escape, their fates sealed by starvation and relentless bombardment. As the fighting escalated throughout August, the Germans continued to destroy Soviet formations sent to halt their advance, though at a cost. German casualties were mounting and the pace of the offensive was beginning to slow. On August 16th, Höppner's 4th Panzer Group reached the city of Novgorod, where they launched a rapid blitz toward the Luga River line, laying the groundwork for the eventual encirclement of Leningrad. This positioning marked the initial siege locations, stretching from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga, and set the stage for the city's isolation. In line with Hitler's infamous Commissar order, Höppner fully implemented a scorched earth policy against the Bolsheviks, showing no mercy to Soviet civilians or political commissars. He also collaborated closely with the SS Einsatzgruppen, who were tasked with perceived enemies of the Nazi regime. Höppner's ruthlessness in executing these orders earned him the trust of Hitler, who envisioned him leading a triumphal procession through the streets of Leningrad after its capture, with Field Marshal von Leib being hailed as the city's conqueror. However, Hitler's plans were abruptly disrupted on August 27th, when Finland's Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the commander of the Finnish forces, announced that his troops would no longer work directly with Leib's Army Group North in the assault on Leningrad. Mannerheim, focused on retaking the territory Finland had lost to the Soviet Union in 1940, had no desire to participate in the destruction of Leningrad. This unexpected declaration shocked the Germans, as they had relied on Finnish cooperation for the complete encirclement of the city. Recognizing that the Finns would not assist in taking Leningrad, Leib reassembled his forces on August 29th and prepared for a prolonged siege without their help. By August 30th, Army Group North had advanced to the outskirts of Leningrad, cutting off the final railway link at the Neva River. The city was now fully encircled, both by land and water, with no escape for its residents. The vice-like grip of the German forces tightened, and it appeared that Leningrad was on the verge of collapse. On September 1st, German Krupp cannons fired on Leningrad for the first time, marking the beginning of a relentless artillery bombardment. As German forces closed in on the city, Hitler decided that a direct assault would be too costly in terms of German lives. Instead, he shifted tactics, ordering that Leningrad be starved into submission. The plan was simple but brutal: encircle the city, cut off all supply lines, and wait for the population to die of hunger and disease. That same day, in the Battle of Polampi, Mannerheim's 4th Corps inflicted a devastating defeat on the Soviet 23rd Army, clearing the way for Finnish forces to advance further into Soviet territory. By September 7th, Mannerheim had established his new field headquarters at the Svir River in eastern Karelia, where he would oversee the remaining operations. Finland, now positioned on the outskirts of Leningrad, had become Germany's only remaining ally in the north, though Mannerheim continued to refuse any involvement in the direct assault on the city. On September 8th, Lieb's forces captured the Soviet outpost of Mega-Schlisselburg, located 10 kilometers east of Leningrad. This victory severed the last of Leningrad's communication routes via overland roads, completing the encirclement. With the city isolated and surrounded, its fate seemed sealed. The Siege of Leningrad, which would become one of the longest and most harrowing in modern history, had officially begun. On the evening of September 8, 1941, Leningrad faced its first significant air raid as 2 waves of German bombers struck the city. Their primary target was the city's food depots, a calculated move aimed at crippling Leningrad's ability to feed its population during the siege. Elena Scriabina, a resident of the city, witnessed the devastation firsthand, and later wrote in her diary, "The Bardaiv warehouses are totally destroyed. These warehouses contained the bulk of Leningrad's food reserves, and their destruction sent shockwaves through the city." With the supplies gone, Leningrad's fate was sealed. It would soon face widespread starvation. The loss of the Bardaiv warehouses was catastrophic, leaving the city in imminent danger of hunger and desperation. The city was now almost completely blockaded, surrounded by German forces on the west, south, and east, while Finnish forces controlled the north. Thus began the historic Siege of Leningrad, a brutal 872-day ordeal that would become one of the longest and deadliest sieges in modern history. The population would endure almost 3 years of hunger, cold, and relentless bombardment, with the blockade cutting off nearly all supplies of food, fuel, and medicine. For Stalin and Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Command, Leningrad had to be defended at all costs. The city, named after Lenin and a symbol of Soviet power, had immense political, cultural, and military significance. The defense of Leningrad became a matter of national pride, and intense combat raged on its outskirts as Soviet forces fought to relieve the pressure. One of the fiercest battles took place near Sinyavino, located on the southwest bank of Lake Ladoga, approximately 10 miles east of the city. Here, the Soviet 54th Army launched repeated offensives in an attempt to break the German stranglehold. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, yet the Soviet forces were unable to break through the German lines. At the same time, desperate battles were fought for control of the southern suburbs of Leningrad, including Pushkin and Krasnoye Selo. These areas were home to the magnificent Catherine Summer Palace, a symbol of Russia's imperial past. The palace itself suffered severe damage during the fighting, but its most prized treasure, the Amber Room, was of particular interest to the Nazis. The intricate panels of the Amber Room, considered a masterpiece of 18th century art, were dismantled by German forces and transported back to Königsberg in East Prussia. This theft became one of the most infamous art-looting operations of World War II, and the Amber Room has since become one of the greatest mysteries of the war, with its whereabouts still unknown. While the Germans sought to tighten their grip on Leningrad, not all of their allies were willing to participate in the siege. The Finns, under Marshal Mannerheim, had refused to join the direct assault on the city, instead focusing on recapturing territory lost to the Soviets during the Winter War. In their place, Spain sent volunteers to support the Nazi cause. The 250th Blue Division, commanded by Major General Agustin Muñoz Grandes, arrived on the Eastern Front and was quickly thrown into the fighting near Leningrad. These Spanish volunteers, fiercely anti-communist, fought alongside German forces in the sector between Lake Ilmen and the western bank of the Volkhov River. The Blue Division was reinforced by elements of the 38th Corps and 38th Panzer, who joined the efforts to break through Soviet defences and support the German push towards Leningrad. As the siege intensified, the fighting reached a peak on September 17, 1941. 6 divisions from Army Group North moved in from the south, aiming to crush Soviet resistance and complete the encirclement of the city. Yet, the Red Army, bolstered by Soviet naval and air force units, mounted a ferocious defense. In his memoirs, General Georgy Zhukov, who had been dispatched to Leningrad by Stalin to oversee the city's defense, recalled the pivotal role played by the Baltic Fleet in stalling the German advance. The guns of the Baltic Fleet rained down shells, Zhukov wrote, as the German forces closed in on the city. As the battlefield drew closer to the coast, the navy and its coastal artillery became increasingly important. The fleet's heavy artillery, stationed on warships and coastal batteries, played a crucial role in supporting the ground troops and repelling the German assault. Despite the relentless German push, the Soviets managed to hold the line, if only temporarily. Leningrad was far from safe, but the city's defenders were determined to fight on. The battle for the city had just begun, and as winter approached, the stakes grew even higher. Both the Germans and Soviets prepared for the long siege that would test the endurance and will of Leningrad's people like never before. The guns of the iconic 1917 Russian Revolution ship Aurora, a symbol of the Bolshevik uprising, also played a role in the defense of Leningrad. The ship's heavy weapons, once used in the revolution, were removed, moved inland, and strategically reinstalled on Pulkovo Heights, located to the south of the city. From this elevated position, the Soviet forces used the Aurora's guns to bombard advancing German troops, adding symbolic weight to the city's defense. The Soviet Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Vladimir Tributs and Admiral Ivan S. Isakov, played an essential role in both the defense of Leningrad and its civilian evacuation efforts. As German forces encircled the city, 6 distinct brigades of Soviet Marines and sailors were activated to help coordinate and oversee the evacuation of Leningrad civilians, particularly women, children, and the elderly. These naval units also fought fiercely alongside the Red Army, sustaining heavy casualties in their attempts to push back the Germans. Despite the overwhelming odds, and even after losing many of their commanders to enemy fire, the sailors continued their relentless defense of the besieged city. By mid-October, the bitter reality of the coming winter began to set in. Snowflakes fell on October 16th, a foreboding sign of the harsh winter conditions that would soon engulf the Eastern Front. German soldiers stationed outside Leningrad, who had been advancing confidently throughout the summer and fall, quickly realized they were ill-prepared for the changing weather. Still dressed in their summer uniforms, they now faced the rapidly dropping temperatures and snowfall. The German High Command, led by Hitler, had disastrously assumed that the war would be won by the time winter arrived, making no provisions for adequate winter gear. This failure would soon lead to one of the German army's most severe logistical crises during the entire campaign. Field reports showed that German forces, led by von Lieb, had shifted from an aggressive offensive to a more defensive posture. The Germans were building dugouts, fitting out bunkers and pillboxes, and securing their battlefields with mines and other barriers, Zhukov recalled. The Soviets, having observed this behaviour, recognized that the German advance was stalling. Captured prisoners confirmed that the Germans were now preparing for winter, an indication that their momentum had been broken and that the siege was set to drag on into the brutal cold. This ill-preparedness was largely due to Hitler's overconfidence. Column General Franz Halder, in his post-war memoirs, reflected on the critical mistake of ignoring winter preparations. The Army Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, requested that arrangements be made immediately for the provision of specialized winter clothing, Halder recalled, but he was curtly refused with the remark that the fighting would have long since ended by the start of winter. Hitler had believed that the war would be a quick and decisive victory, with German troops back in control of the eastern territories before the onset of the cold. His assumption was that only a few occupying forces would remain in the east, for whom standard winter equipment would suffice. This oversight would prove disastrous as the men froze, and many died from exposure. By October, the German army's logistics were in disarray, and they faced the brutal reality of fighting in one of the harshest winters in history without adequate supplies or gear. German troops, stretched thin across the Eastern Front, began to suffer immensely as temperatures plummeted. Thousands would die not just from battle, but from the unforgiving Russian winter. On October 20th, as both sides braced for the coming winter, the Soviets launched a bold counter-offensive, known as the Second Sinyavino Offensive, in an effort to break the German encirclement of Leningrad. The operation aimed to alleviate the city's siege by sending 63,000 Soviet troops, 97 tanks, and 474 artillery pieces into the fray against 54,000 well-entrenched German soldiers. Soviet forces attacked with the hope of breaking through German lines and reopening supply routes to Leningrad. Despite their overwhelming firepower and sheer determination, the Germans, still well positioned around the city, managed to hold their ground. The second Signavino offensive, though ultimately unsuccessful in lifting the siege, marked a significant escalation in the ongoing battle for Leningrad. It underscored the desperation of the Soviet forces to relieve the city's suffering, as winter threatened to turn the siege into an even deadlier ordeal. The Siege of Leningrad would continue through the freezing months, as both sides suffered from hunger, cold, and heavy casualties. For the people of Leningrad, the destruction of their food supplies and the continued German blockade meant that starvation and suffering were now inescapable realities, while the German soldiers themselves began to feel the crippling effects of the winter they were so unprepared for. As the temperature plummeted, the combat around Leningrad grew even more ferocious. Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet military commander overseeing the city's defense, was astonished when he received the latest frontline reports from Moscow. The Soviet forces, which had numbered nearly 1 million men on October 1st, had been reduced to just 250,000 in the following weeks due to the overwhelming German onslaught and severe casualties. To the south, Soviet authorities were equally alarmed as German forces advanced to within 30 miles of Moscow, threatening the capital. By the time winter arrived, it came with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted to brutal lows, and the German army, still dressed in their summer uniforms, was utterly unprepared for the severe Russian winter. The extreme cold froze guns, immobilized motorized vehicles, and even killed the draft horses the Germans relied on for transport. Many German soldiers froze to death as the army's leadership, having assumed the war would be over before winter, had not provided adequate winter clothing or supplies. On the other hand, the Soviet forces, better equipped for the harsh winter, embraced their age-old ally, General Winter. Just as he had stalled Napoleon's forces over a century earlier, the Russian winter was now wreaking havoc on the German invaders. Corporal Wilhelm Lubeck, an artillery forward observer with the German 58th Division, later recalled the sheer brutality of the cold. "We started to face extremely cold temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, he remembered. The temperature was significantly lower than anything we had previously encountered in Germany. Injured soldiers on both sides were often left to freeze where they fell, unable to be retrieved in the icy conditions. In the months that followed, frostbite and exposure claimed more lives." Lubeck also noted how the cold affected their weapons. "Unless we fired them frequently or took precautions to keep them safe from the cold, the temperatures dipped so low that the oil in our weapons literally froze. I was informed by other soldiers that they had seen whole steam engines frozen solid, even down to the oil on their wheels." In an effort to entice Finland further into the war, Adolf Hitler made an enticing offer to Finnish Foreign Minister Rolf Witting on November 27th. Hitler promised that, once Leningrad was destroyed, the city would be handed over to Finland, with the Neva River becoming the new border between Finland and Nazi Germany. Despite this generous offer, the Finns, content with regaining the territories they had lost to the Soviet Union in 1940, refused to launch a direct assault on Leningrad. As a result, Field Marshal von Leeb, commander of Army Group North, found himself in a military quagmire. Unable to count on Finnish support, Leeb was left to continue the siege without additional forces to strike Leningrad from the north. Despite their reluctance to attack the city, Finnish forces remained positioned just 22 miles northeast of Leningrad. This proximity forced every Soviet commander defending the city to consider the possibility of a future Finnish attack. Meanwhile, the siege continued, with Leningrad's population trapped inside the city's rapidly deteriorating defences. During the siege, Marshal Kirill Meretskov played a key role in commanding the Soviet forces on the Leningrad front. Initially commanding the 7th Red Army and the Volkhov Front, Meretskov was later assigned to lead the 4th Red Army at the Battle of Tikhvin. His forces succeeded in routing General Georg von Kuchler's 18th German Army on December 9th after brutal combat in deep snow. The German survivors, frozen and demoralized, were forced to retreat westward to the Volkhov River. Meretskhov's victory at Tikhvin was the first large-scale, successful Soviet counterattack of World War II, providing a critical morale boost to Soviet forces as the harsh winter set in. Despite this success, Hitler stubbornly refused to allow any withdrawal of German forces. On December 20th, he issued a no-retreat order in response to his field commander's requests to pull back. Every unit must be brought home with the will to hold out, Hitler declared to Colonel General Franz Halder. Regardless of any enemy breakthrough on their rear or flanks, the men have to be compelled to put up fierce resistance in their lines. Hitler insisted that reinforcements would be sent from the West and from Germany, believing that this war of attrition would eventually turn in Germany's favour. Meanwhile, the people of Leningrad were suffering from hunger on an unimaginable scale. On Christmas Day, 1941, 3,700 people starved to death, a grim increase from the average of 1,500 deaths per day due to starvation. Food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, and desperate citizens consumed anything they could find. Some boiled wallpaper paste, others dug up and ate tulip bulbs, and many resorted to gnawing on wood. Pets disappeared from the streets, and as food became even scarcer, the horrific spectre of cannibalism began to take hold. One woman, traumatized, recalled seeing the partially eaten body of a young girl buried under the stairs of an apartment building. The city was soon overrun with cannibals, as a city official grimly noted. By early January 1942, the situation had become unbearable. Alexander Boldyrev, a resident of Leningrad, wrote in his diary, "The death rate is insane. I personally witnessed a convoy of sledges travelling to the graveyard while carrying coffins, crates or just bodies in bags. The corpses I saw there were discarded at the entryway, unaltered and turning black in the snow. Is the end in sight? We are a snow-covered metropolis of the dead." The city's central heating system had been shut down due to a lack of fuel, leaving citizens freezing in their homes. The daily struggle for survival was becoming increasingly desperate. Despite the blockade that had cut off all roads and railways into the city, the road of life over the frozen Lake Ladoga became the only lifeline for Leningrad. A daring plan was enacted to send convoys of trucks across the frozen lake, carrying food and supplies to the starving city and evacuating as many civilians as possible. The Luftwaffe bombed and strafed these convoys relentlessly, sometimes launching 7 or 8 air raids in a single day. Nevertheless, the trucks continued their perilous journeys day and night, keeping Leningrad's fragile supply lines open. Even with these efforts, the death toll in the city remained staggering, with an estimated 8,000 people dying each day in February 1942 alone. On January 8, 1942, Merezkov's Volkhov Front launched the Demyansk Offensive, also known as the Luban Offensive, in an effort to break through the German lines. Soviet forces, including the 2nd Shock and 59th Armies dressed in white camouflage, attacked the German 1st and 38th Corps with fierce determination. Despite their tenacity, the offensive made little progress. Further south, the SS Totenkopf 30th and 299th Infantry Divisions were engaged by the Northwestern Front in brutal combat, resulting in heavy casualties. The fighting around Leningrad remained fierce, with vast numbers of soldiers battling in some of the harshest conditions of the war. Throughout the month of January, the Soviets continued to press their attacks, but the results were modest. After weeks of exhausting combat, the Red Army took a brief pause to resupply, gather reinforcements, and prepare for a renewed offensive. Meanwhile, in the Demyansk pocket, 90,000 German soldiers from 5 divisions were trapped by the Soviet encirclement. Only air deliveries of food and ammunition kept them alive as they endured the freezing conditions. In March, German relief columns began moving to break through the Soviet lines and rescue their comrades trapped in the pocket. Life for the soldiers in the Demyansk pocket was miserable. Personal hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain, with showers and baths a distant memory. Lice infested every seam of their uniforms, and diseases like frostbite and dysentery ran rampant among the troops. Despite these conditions, the Germans fought on, desperate for relief. In a brutal counterattack on March 19th, Kukula's 18th Army inflicted heavy losses on the Soviet 2nd Shock Army near the Volkhov River, killing around 130,000 Red Army soldiers. Following this success, a 5-division German relief force prepared to break through and free the trapped soldiers in the Demyansk pocket. As the spring thaw arrived in early April 1942, the Volkhov battlefield transformed into a muddy quagmire. Wilhelm Lubeck of the 58th Division, who had fought there, later recalled the challenges of battling in the swamp-like conditions. "At first, the warmer weather was appreciated," he wrote, "but we quickly learned that fighting in the sweltering heat of a marsh was much more unpleasant." The mud, combined with rising heat, turned the battlefield into a nightmarish trap where movement became difficult and soldiers on both sides struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain. During one intense skirmish, Lubeck found himself alongside a machine gunner as Red Army soldiers launched a fierce assault on their position. The MG-42 gunner fired frantically, so often that he had to swap out barrels as they overheated. To cool them, he would throw the red-hot barrels into a nearby pool of water. Meanwhile, Lubeck was running low on ammunition for his MP-40 machine pistol. At one point, he leaned down to reload another magazine and noticed that the machine gun beside him had suddenly gone silent. He assumed the gunner was reloading or switching barrels again, but when he looked over, he saw the man crumpled on the ground. A moment later, Lubeck noticed blood trickling from a hole in the gunner's temple just beneath the rim of his helmet. The deadly accuracy of the shot suggested it had come from a sniper's rifle, though the noise of battle had drowned out the sound of the shot. It struck Lubeck that had he not bent down to reload at that precise moment, the bullet might have been meant for him. Despite the brutal conditions and relentless fighting, Hitler remained determined to break through in the north. In April 1942, he issued another order to Army Group North, directing them to retake Leningrad and join forces with the Finns. The German relief force finally succeeded in breaking through the Soviet encirclement of the Demyansk pocket on April 20th, coincidentally Hitler's birthday, and linked up with the SS Totenkopf division along the Lovat River. This relief effort allowed trapped German forces to escape, but the larger Soviet Demyansk-Lyuban offensive ended in disaster, with over 213,000 Soviet troops wounded and more than 95,000 killed or missing. By the time the offensive was called off on May 30th, the Second Shock Army had been surrounded and nearly annihilated by a German counterattack. At the same time, up to 100,000 people were starving to death each month in Leningrad. While Germany's Army Group Centre and South continued to fight with intense resolve, the fighting in the north came to a grinding halt over the summer of 1942. Both sides were too exhausted to achieve a decisive victory. By August, the situation around Leningrad had stabilised somewhat, but the suffering within the city persisted. On August 9, 1942, a remarkable event took place within the besieged city of Leningrad. The Philharmonic Hall hosted a special concert featuring Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The composition, written during the siege, was intended to inspire and uplift the beleaguered residents. Conductor Karl Eliasberg introduced the performance by addressing the packed hall, filled with malnourished civilians and wounded soldiers alike. "Comrades, a great event in our city's cultural history is about to take place," Eliasberg declared. "You'll hear from our countryman, Dmitri Shostakovich, for the first time in a few minutes. Here in Leningrad, when the enemy, filled with hatred, attempted to invade our city for the first time, he started writing his famous composition. Everyone thought that Leningrad's days were ended when the fascist pigs were bombarding and shelling us. However, this performance demonstrates our resilience, bravery, and spirit." The symphony echoed throughout the hall, bringing tears to many eyes, but also renewing their hope. Yet, as the music ended, the people of Leningrad knew they still had many months of hardship ahead. Later that month, on August 27th, Soviet forces launched the Sinyavino offensive in another attempt to break the German siege. Despite their best efforts, the offensive was ultimately unsuccessful, like many others before it. The siege of Leningrad continued, and the city remained under constant bombardment. Relief would not come until January 1943. On January 12, 1943, the Red Army, with 12 divisions, launched a major attack to reopen a land corridor to the besieged city. Known as Operation Iskra, Spark, this offensive was more successful than previous attempts and managed to force open a narrow corridor through which supplies could be brought into Leningrad. The road, previously known as the Road of Life, was partially restored, bringing hope to the city's starving residents. 2 days later, Marshal Zhukov personally witnessed a significant discovery on the battlefield. Between two Red Army frontline positions, Soviet troops had encountered a strange new German tank, unlike any they had seen before. "Our gunners had struck a panzer that didn't resemble the tanks we were familiar with," Zhukov recalled. "The Nazis made a concerted effort to haul it away. To seize the enemy tank and pull it to our positions, we assembled a special team consisting of 4 tanks and an infantry platoon, backed by heavy mortar fire and a strong cannon. This tank was none other than the first experimental model of the Tiger, a new heavy panzer. Soviet engineers quickly analysed the captured tank and identified its weak points. This intelligence would later prove invaluable when the Germans deployed Tiger tanks in large numbers at the battles of Kursk, allowing Soviet forces to counter the threat more effectively. Operation Iskra successfully established a tenuous land corridor to Leningrad, allowing for the evacuation of civilians and the delivery of much-needed supplies. However, it wasn't until January 27, 1944, during the Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive, that the siege was finally broken after 872 harrowing days. By the time the siege ended, an estimated 1,500,000 Leningrad residents had died from malnutrition, disease, and German shelling. The toll on the Axis forces was also immense. By 1944, Nazi Germany, Finland, Fascist Spain, Romania, Hungary and Italy had lost nearly 580,000 men to death, injury or capture in the campaign to take Leningrad. In reflecting on the siege years later, Marshal Zhukov triumphantly declared that the sailors, soldiers and Leningraders would sooner die than give up their city. Despite being surrounded, Leningrad's factories had continued to produce vast quantities of war materiel, including nearly 3,000 regimental and anti-tank guns, 480 armoured vehicles, 59 armoured trains, 713 tanks, and over 3 million mines and shells. The tenacity and ingenuity of the city's residents and defenders allowed them to keep producing weapons and ammunition even as the blockade closed in. The siege also saw some of the fiercest fighting of the war. At its height, 930,000 Soviet soldiers faced off against 725,000 Axis troops. The human cost was staggering on both sides, with the Soviet Northern Front suffering over 3.4 million casualties, including more than 1 million dead, captured or missing. An additional 400,000 civilians died during evacuations. Zhukov, looking back at the siege decades later, reflected on its historical significance. For the first time in the history of modern wars, he said, the besieger who had blockaded a large city for a long time was routed by a simultaneous strike from outside and inside the beleaguered region. It was a hard-won victory, and the cost in human lives was immense, but the Axis forces had been driven from Leningrad, and the city's industry and spirit remained unbroken. In the years following the war, Leningrad, renamed St. Petersburg, was fully rebuilt and restored to its former grandeur. The scars of the siege have long since faded, but the city's monuments and museums continue to honour the bravery and sacrifice of its defenders. St. Petersburg is once again a beautiful and vibrant city, a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. The full retreat from Leningrad marked a decisive shift in the Eastern Front as Soviet forces broke the years-long siege and pressed westward, forcing the German 18th Army to fall back under relentless pressure. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts alone boasted a numerical advantage of at least 6-1 in armoured fighting vehicles and aircraft over the German forces, making the German position increasingly untenable. The combined strength of the three Soviet fronts amounted to the equivalent of 105 infantry divisions and 12 tank brigades, creating a formidable force that even the hardened German divisions struggled to counter. Despite the obvious need for a strategic withdrawal, Adolf Hitler refused all proposals for an early retreat to the prepared Ostwall defences, instead insisting on making the Soviet advance as costly as possible. He believed that every inch of territory captured should come at a high price as the German forces attempted to keep the Soviet forces at bay and as far from German soil as possible. As the northern wing of the 18th Army began to withdraw westward, SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner's 3rd, Germanic, SS Panzer Corps faced fierce combat, managing to hold the Soviet advance back until January 26, 1944. In non-stop engagements, Steiner's forces conducted a fighting retreat, gradually giving ground to the overwhelming Soviet pressure. In the coastal sector, Danish SS Obersturmbannführer Christian Peder Kryssing was tasked with fortifying and restructuring defences, coordinating efforts to stabilise the retreat. Among those engaged in this grueling withdrawal were the Dutch 4th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Brigade Nederland, who fought alongside other European volunteers from non-German Waffen-SS divisions. These foreign SS units formed a significant part of the defence in the Baltic sector, battling to slow down the Soviet advance in a 150-kilometre retreat to the Narva River in Estonia. The withdrawal marked a temporary pause in the Soviet offensive, giving the German forces a chance to regroup and prepare for the brutal battles yet to come along the Narva line. The Leningrad-Novgorod offensive took a brutal toll on both Soviet and German forces, as each side faced staggering losses in this critical engagement. According to American military historian David M. Glantz and Professor Emeritus of Military History Jonathan M. House, the Soviets suffered an estimated 313,953 casualties, with 76,686 killed or missing. In contrast, German sources report that Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units sustained 71,651 casualties, including 24,739 killed and missing. This fierce offensive pushed German forces back between 60 and 100 kilometers from Leningrad to defensive positions along the Luga River, finally breaking the siege that had gripped the city for nearly 900 days. Amidst these battles, Dutch-speaking volunteers from the SS Freiwilligen Legion Flandern, a roughly 1,000-strong unit from German-occupied Belgium, were deployed around Leningrad. These Flemish volunteers faced intense fighting, enduring heavy casualties in the harsh combat conditions. Due to significant losses, the SS Freiwilligen Legion Flandern was eventually disbanded and reformed into the SS Sturmbrigade Langemark, a unit that continued to fight on the Eastern Front. The participation of non-German volunteers like the Flemish legionaries reflects the broader effort by the Waffen-SS to recruit from occupied territories. For the Germans, these foreign volunteers represented both a bolstering of manpower and a powerful ideological statement of a united front against the Soviet Union. However, the immense casualties sustained in battles like the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive underscored the relentless cost of Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of territory, a policy that increasingly wore down the Wehrmacht and its allies. As of today, the Siege of Leningrad remains the worst siege in recorded history. No other siege has matched its prolonged brutality, scale of suffering, or devastating human cost. For nearly 900 days, the people of Leningrad endured relentless starvation, harsh winters, and constant bombardment, resulting in the deaths of over 1 million civilians. Entire generations were marked by the horrors endured, from extreme malnutrition to widespread destruction of their city. In terms of both duration and intensity, the Siege of Leningrad stands as an unparalleled chapter of tragedy and resilience, a grim reminder of the toll of war on civilians and one of the most harrowing examples of human endurance under unthinkable hardship. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.